All right, thank you guys for coming to tonight's Spotlight series. We're so excited to have you. This evening is our last, it concludes our Spotlight series for this year. But I did just want to let you guys know about some exciting news that we've got going on at the library. We have gone fine-free officially. So this is something that started at the beginning of the pandemic. We've decided to keep it around. You can learn more about it by grabbing one of these little pieces of paper by the door. So we're very excited to share that announcement. That's very exciting at the library. But you guys came here for theater, so I'm going to turn it over to Clint Eibel from Falcon Theatre, because it has been a while since we've been here. It has been, gosh.
It is so good to be back at the library and to bring Falcon Theatre. We're very excited because again, we get to have with us our author this evening, Maurice Manning, who is going to be speaking in just a few minutes and reading one of his poems to begin the evening as well. So Falcon takes flight. It is good to be here, and we welcome everybody who is watching on Zoom. So welcome. Hopefully my friend from Arizona is also watching at this very moment too. So this evening, I just want to make a couple of comments about the program. There have been just a couple of changes. The actor Dan Durger is not feeling well, so he will not be with us. But this evening, Ted Weil, who is our producing artistic director, will be reading his poems. We also have with us Lisa Durkas, Terry Gosden, and Tara Williams. At this time, I'd like to again thank Amy and the library staff here at Newport and Campbell County Library for providing these kinds of programs. And at this time, turn it over to Maurice Manning. Either one.
Belonging to the ages. I play in a play belonging to the ages, and silences ringing out, as if designed by a mind whose poetry is empty pages. The only player, too, on darkened stages, artistic in my way, though not refined. I play in a play belonging to the ages. But theaters are merely painted cages, rooms to watch, imagination confined by a mind whose poetry is empty pages. In life, I borrowed lines from all the sages and found myself to airy nothings confined, to play in a play belonging to the ages. A tempest in this narrow house still rages, as if the service of the dead is assigned by a mind whose poetry is empty pages. A house divided? Oh, formless form, whose wages must endlessly be paid, yet not divined. I play in a play belonging to the ages, by a mind whose poetry is empty pages. I wrote Railsplitter mostly in 2017 because Abraham Lincoln had been sitting on my shoulder for about 20 years. He'd certainly been important in my life since childhood, but he became an increasing presence in my poetic thinking as I visited Kentucky history, culture, and geography in all of the poems I've written over the years. Kentucky has always been my subject, my home and history, the beginning and end of all my thoughts, the place of human hope and folly as I have understood them and inherited their reality. Lincoln seemed to be a culminating figure based on my previous books, homespun and humble, but also wise, hopeful, and humane. Taking on Lincoln as a subject for poetry as well as a poetic voice was intimidating and perhaps audacious, but as I came to know Lincoln through his speeches, addresses, and letters, I became more comfortable with the prospect. Imagining, for example, how Lincoln might have thought about lines from Shakespeare's speeches applied to his own circumstances was a captivating and enriching experience. Lincoln, as I came to know him, invited such imaginative endeavors. Artistic curiosity then was my first step, as is always the case. However, my artistic interests soon became wrapped up in the sad reality of our national division, our persistent racism and racial violence, and the many signs that our national bonds were once again fraying. Could Lincoln speak to his own time and to our own at once? Could he remain bound to his own history and yet speak beyond it? Has our yearning for individuality eclipsed our togetherness? These were some of the questions I hoped the poem would pursue. Whether my own efforts address such questions adequately is almost beside the point. I learned that Lincoln is more than a person, more than a key figure in American history. I learned that he embodied our best national principles and our national character. That character is far from perfect and not without flaw. But I think Lincoln knew this about himself and went forward in spite of making mistakes along the way. Above all, I learned that Lincoln attained his sense of self through poetry. He memorized poems by Thomas Gray and his favorite Robert Burns, but he also had committed whole passages of Shakespeare to memory and often walked the halls reciting lines, teasing the strands of metaphor and lulling his mind with poetic phrase and rhythm. All of that technical material seamlessly woven together composes a good poem. The language, the sound, the rhythm, the figuration, and the metaphor. Lincoln had a knack for understanding each of these features of poetry as an element of the craft, each worthy of its own study, but he took the whole as a living expression, and from it he found his own life and indeed his own purpose.
That part of the country is, within itself, as unpoetical as any spot of the earth. That's a claim I would revise if I were living now. I aspired to poetry back then, to be thought of as wise and full of feeling, to capture something in the world, to put some words in rhythms and rhyme and follow the fashion of the time. Poem had to be sincere, and it had to be pretty. And the poem had to reveal the poet's virtues, nothing to ruffle the feathers of taste or confess a human flaw. Art and perfection were bound together, but I won't subscribe to perfect art. Not now. I believe that poetry is made from absence, out of nothing or no place real. The poem flies as coldly as a hawk, or else as sweetly as a wren, or it trots along as an old blind horse. The mind is an empty theater, and there is nothing on the stage, yet from the dark void, a voice begins to sound itself and say its terrible lines, and then to change them, to make them smoother, to make them more than words and more than a dream in the mind. And then the words in the mind are free, and the poet too is free, until another voice speaks from the darkness. I was born and raised in purgatory, and I heard many voices there. One was even my mother's, singing. Others I heard in books or silence. Then one day I heard my own, a voice so clear it startled me.
To a chigger. Oh, itchy beast of tiny figure, when I scratched myself, I made you bigger. Though you began as but a chigger, you redder rose, a pistol butt without a trigger, thus we were foes. In armpit high or ankle lower, you left me last to be the knower that you were first to be the goer where sweat may trickle. And I was felled as by a mower with scythe and sickle. Though felled hyperbolizes true, the minor wounds I got from you, the itchiness I felt undue, a fierce attacking I never would have dreamed to woo from one so lacking. Yet me you often so infested, I felt my life had been divested, and bitterness I had ingested in the hotter days of youth when meaning is contested in lofty ways. But in age and temperament I seasoned, and with your kind I learned and reasoned, as an older dog contends with fleas and resolves the pest, deserves its life, though it has treasoned, and takes his rest. You are a bug of southern climes, yet strangely strode all through my times, symbolically, a bell whose chimes in turn are grating, refusing love to find that rhymes are dull, negating.
A brief refutation of the rumor that I allowed Willie and Tad to relieve themselves in my upturned hat on a Sunday morning at the office while their mother was attending religious services. I would allow a tall hat can be put to purposes other than the polite covering of the head. And the record shows that I carried papers in mine, important papers too. And for dramatic effect, I pulled them out in court, bewildering my opponents. But that was practical. The documents intended to prove my claim were sheltered from the weather, less likely to be lost. And having words I'd taken care to write, approximate to the head from which they sprang, permitted me to ponder them, to keep them, so to speak, in the nest a little longer, before they flew into the room to batter against the smudged windows of a prairie courthouse amid the clangs of punctuating spittoon. It was a commonplace to fill my hat with oats and feed my horse when I was riding on the circuit. And the rooming houses where I lodged had few accommodations, so the hat was handy as a basin if a morning ablution were required. On this occasion, however, the hat was mere amusement for the boys, who set it on the office floor and pitched pennies into it, stepping farther back each round as I was reading on the couch. Their mother was indeed at church. The weather was profoundly cold, and the privy regrettably distant from the office. So, boys being boys, with a famously permissive father, I agreed to let them use my oot.
3 cheers for the know-nothings. When a public man makes a claim designed to appeal to popular opinion, subverting the fact that underneath the claim a more insidious aim resides, that when discovered will prove to be unpopular, that man has drawn a line across his throat. And yet, the public will not have the truth, which gives the public man his license and leisure to subvert it. Our citizens are mean and simple, expecting hope and hot reaction at once. If their inclusion in a scheme or proposition requires excluding others from the same, in general, they'll rally to it. Folly, selfishness, or merely the long drag of deprivation, as an animal dragging an implement against unyielding ground, when the switch is smartly applied, continues its way. And the man who wields the switch is praised for the moment. But then he'll be undone.
The sound of the earth convulsing. Mother was certain God was coming for us, and the trumpet of the end of time had sounded deafeningly blown by a band of angels. In the morning, Father went outside to report that the scarecrow had toppled over, an arm was sticking up, and a crow had lighted on it. It was the winter, and the field was barren. I remember watching a log roll out of the fire and roll back in again, repeatedly, until it rested on the coals and blazed to life as if it had never moved. And then around daybreak, it happened again. We heard a hillside of shale slide down the western ridge. By now, we were all outside to watch, and Father joked that a shorter ridge would surely mean a longer day, more time, and a chance to raise the place a peg or two closer to real prosperity. But that condition never remained a stranger to us. 3 times the bowl of our little valley shook and trembled many more, and the sound went around as if the heavens themselves were crying out. The last of these convulsions coinciding with the day to mark my 3rd year living. The little cabin bounced with the earth, yet stood, because, as Father said, it was designed to move. Lap joints, pegs, and notches, not a nail anywhere to make it stiff. Reckoning now, if God himself was the shaker, I'm not inclined to call it punishment. I'm not inclined to call it anything. Even if church bells in Boston rang, suggesting that a joy or a grief had come to the land, or maybe only the earth was shaking itself.
Little Billy Herndon. Number 1, reading the law. Why, bless his heart, his mama said, and then smacked the back of Billy's head. A lawyer man must stand up tall, but honey, you're a tad bit small. Perhaps another line you'll choose, or fetch a taller pair of shoes. I fear you'll wind up with that fool who never went a year to school. Number 2, fancy dress ball. There once was a man named Herndon who fell for a gal that spurned him. They vowed at the dance, there endeth romance, but nevertheless it earned him. 3, writs, claims, statutes, deeds. Like me, ordained by the emptiness of Kentucky, removed like me to the emptiness of the prairie, and both of us standing before the emptiness, the physical and metaphysical, believing surely something is in both, a cause, a purpose, uneasy, steady friendship, thoughts to keep to ourselves, a world to make, philosophy, geometry to ponder, and everywhere poetry to savor, and even matchless Billy, a joke to tell.
By God, I was a sly, gesticulating fool. Unfolding myself to rise in court required a rousing double jerk that ever proved to startle the clerk and the judge. When I rose from a chair too short to sail as a ship listing to port, yet adduced to these flamboyant quirks, employed that an anecdote might work. I tugged the whiskers on my wart, all for emphasis, to make my homely body homelier, and let my right hand be a wrench to the left to loosen the tail, and take a mooring sharply at the pier, unloading reason at the bench.
John Brown's baby has a cold upon its chest. If the actor hadn't shot me, I might have lived. Like Whitman in Melville, for most of my century, the first president, American-born and not from a state that had ever been a colony. The new America, settled ahead of law and reason by those who believed sincerely in the promise, whose design implied the promise, and those who took it for granted or took it for themselves, driven by greed or necessity to move the West much farther west. Up to the war, I can tell you this. The slave owners wished to extend a colonial system using American law to back it and cover up the sin. Now, if that doesn't sound familiar, then I'm not dead old Honest Abe. Getting a law on the books means future debate will be confined to the law alone and exclude the truth, or dare I say, the the moral barb the law is intended to blunt or cover up. And so the law enters the books to serve deceit.
You in later centuries may like to know how all of this works. I cannot see your time. I am only permitted to see a few years beyond my own. And the actor cut it short. Curious too, Whitman and Melville separately described John Brown as a meteor, a metaphor to herald the war. But here the art is also deceiving, for the skies of 1859 and 60 were known for meteoric events. The gleaming, shooting stars were real, and all the poet had to do to find the metaphor was read the news or lazily look up into the sky. Another way to think of this is to imagine poetry was simply in the air, as John Brown would be, suspended by a rope.
And by the way, the actor was there to see him hang, disguised in the blue of a US uniform, to watch the old man drop and kick. A greater reality, perhaps, than the actor was used to. The same actor who, with his brother, commissioned the bronze statue of Shakespeare in Central Park for all to see. The bard himself, presented by men who played his parts on stage and were regaled as men of great refinement. But I always took refinement lightly, and that left room for comedy, a genre, you should know, the actor thought was beneath his station and talent. Though, after murdering me in the second act of one, he leapt to the stage and broke his leg, a play within the play that produced, in my final moment of hearing, laughter. The great tragedian reduced to play a rude mechanical who blunders his Latin line, hopping across the interrupted stage to exit.
But the war invited comedy. Why, ladies and gentlemen would picnic on a hill above a battle to watch the slaughter and dab their mouths with handkerchiefs. It also welcomed song, at first austere, with strident battle hymn, whose truth goes marching on, so soon becoming John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave, and later the farcical John Brown's baby has a cold upon his chest. The melody was easily adaptable. And the busy photographers lugging their boxes of glass plates to the field, sometimes posing the dead genuine bathos to show the public what they were missing. Young men poetically arranged who moments before had been singing, reciting light verse or prayers under their breath, when the shadow of death directed the art of dying should commence at once. And only the dead were uniform.
Learning to write with a feather. The claim my cousin offered after I died that he'd killed a buzzard for a single feather in order to bend my fingers around the quill that I might learn the shapes of letters is true. How strange that I could read almost anything and grasp it. If I read it twice out loud, I could recall it ever after, word for word. There's a divinity that shapes our ends. A line from Hamlet I used to savor because it sounds just right. Yet the meaning bounds away as the mind, desiring comprehension, advances. And all of this before I could write my name. For what was printed differed from what was written. It didn't occur to me in early years that reading was the offspring of writing. So getting ahead in reading was backing up. The once I began with letters, I hadn't ink or money for it, or paper. And furthermore, I hadn't anything of my own to say. So I copied all of Hamlet in the air, from his father's ghost and on to Yorick's skull, the black feather twittering like a wren, a single feather representing the bird in full synecdoche. It is. My mother, who could read but couldn't write, presented all of her person with an X.
On having a fondness for sentimental songs and verses. I like the one about the banjo player who takes his banjo with him when he meets his friends up in the sky. The verse says, something else ain't mighty true. The banjo wanna beat our too. The wit delivered by the primitive voice. And I can't argue with the theology, at least it's interesting. If banjos are allowed in heaven, then there's something to do besides patiently counting down eternity or basking in holy light. Not that it matters much to me in my state of being, merely a mind that's tuned, I suppose, to resonate. Let's call it a twang in there, a very American twang, originating from a gourd and a stick and a few strings. A nonsense song may have a deeper meaning, or not. Or maybe it acquires meaning through time. That's very American too. Meaning catching up with time, or time simply ceasing to matter. And the truth is left as plain and silent as a banjo hanging from a peg in the wall. I like that image. Plain American image. And something else ain't mighty true. A banjo with a metaphorical shadow ironically attached to it. An image like that, suspended in time, will change.
The long and short of the matter. What prompts a long and skinny man to hanker for a stout woman? Indeed, a woman whose stoutness stands in marked contrast to the man's gangly, elongated frame. The history of human pairing, my own uncertain tries and erring, even after marriage, staring into the well of wonder, despairing that such condition wants a name. Yet, humming rhymes delightfully, I found there is a history conveyed by earthy poetry, the Jack Sprat philosophy, so I denominated the game, as if tranced and danced around in my mind, recalling Wyatt's hunt of the hind, and Herrick's puns for how he finds those tremblings of different kinds. So for my love, I found the same. I died in service of the state, but the tireless cause did not abate an instinct I felt to procreate, or merely heatedly to mate with Mary, short and stout, and close the daylight out, and blindly many times to her I came.
The philosophy of composition. The locale being thus determined, I had now to introduce the bird, and the thought of introducing him through the window was inevitable. That's unintended poetry, from Poe, one of my favorites. He also said a work of art should begin at the end, a luxury I might have enjoyed had I lived. I ended not at the end, but in the middle. Poetry relieved my mind and deepened it and lifted my heart because the language remained alive. Poe was confident of his talent and sometimes apologized for it, whether sincerely, I can't say. Doesn't really matter now. My verse was coarse, which I accepted, but composition was a love I had longer than any in my life, and versification a noble labor. Precision won't be precise unless it's practiced, and parody can be a useful exercise. Before I read The Raven, I read instead a version about a polecat and a bumpkin named Jeremiah. You can imagine all that happened. That was good enough for me. I found the polecat very affecting. Mad mind in the poem, mad from grief, I understood, but lore and nevermore and poor Lenore were tighter than a Tick's hat band. I could rhyme, but never like that. I suppose introducing a chicken would not have been inevitable, but that might have been my kind of poem. In one of the verses I composed, I was happy to use skedaddle, a rarity in poetry, but it suited the rhythm of the line, and I liked the flock of consonants, how the word almost swallows itself. Say it, feel your throat tickle. They drugged him on election day, whoever they were. They drugged Poe, a volume of forgotten lore himself, and then was nevermore. His parents, by the way, were actors from Virginia, and sadly, they were poor.
Speaking to Mary after a speech. After giving a speech most often to men, eventually I'd wander home, and Mary would inquire about my elocution, whether I'd hit my mark or fallen short or foundered. That was a metaphor my Mary liked. I liked it too because it went two ways at once. Either the so-called ship got stuck on the bar, or the faithful horse went lame. The meaning is restrained yet multiplied. In the primitive country where I was raised, someone would say he's nearly foundered if he found too much to eat. A cow, as I recall, could founder. I foundered myself, or nearly so, a time or two, and once it involved cabbage. I could eat the hell out of some cabbage and then go at it again if there was any left. If a poem to stop the liquor in the pot was not at hand, well, I could drink it down in a gulp and draw my sleeve across my chin. It's humbling to be at a speaking engagement and observe how someone speaking passionately might still not make a lick of sense. And raising the passion only digs a deeper hole. And the argument, when overly explained or too voluminous, can lose its footing in the soup of words, to mix a metaphor, and sound like diarrhea of the mind. Mind with the trots. Spew of empty thoughts. Better to shut your big fat trap and take a gander down to the fishing hole. Not that it matters anymore to me. I'm afraid my days at the fishing hole are over, as are my speaking engagements and everything.
Ballad of Pigeon Creek. 'Twas summertime on Pigeon Creek. Fireflies lit the sky. I was a lonesome rhyming freak, born to the world to die. Verses were my buttered bread, repast of great delight to fill my empty bucket head with rhymes to say and write. Declaiming, I would find a stump and stand upon it tall. The word I think of now is bump. Cannot rhyme them all. The lasses were fair, lads were strong way down on Pigeon Creek. Inheritance was our lonely song, by God, we were the meek. Our schooling was a comedy, but I could pull the thread cut from the cloth of tragedy through all the books I read. And doing that is what I done, as freely as the breeze, and barefoot as a simple pun below the shady trees. But books were scarce on that old stream, back in the way back when. And finishing one, as in a dream, I'd start the book again. There isn't a chorus to the song, nor wisdom here to seek. It ends like the wind blowing along the banks of Pigeon Creek.
The audience. Who are you people, anyway? Does hearing my voice from the dead disturb you? You're probably wondering what to make of this performance. Well, I wonder too. But it doesn't matter to me. I'm dead, as dead as the words written on the page. You have to find the life in them. That's the pleasure of listening to a voice on the stage or reading a book. There's something alive you bring to life by being the reader or seeing a show, and that makes being alive less lonely. All of this expression has been for you. I beg your pardon, I had to pause for a moment to think of the proper word. I expect you know how difficult it is to get the words just right. Expression is too precise. It's better to think of this as a series of notes and meditations, which by nature are incomplete. One of the things you have to accept in life and art are the parts left out, the missing pieces, and the simply inexplicable. What's missing says something by being absent. It is a gesture of the mind to leave it out, and then the gesture of another mind to grasp the absence. But once the absence is grasped, it becomes a complicated emptiness. To fill it, we have the stage and books, but increasingly I find that musing on the emptiness is pleasant enough. And looking over a landscape, one can see where a tree has been, even a wilderness, and contemplate what might have happened and imagine why. What else do you want from my countenance, from my exhausted face staring out?
Railsplitter. I was killed by an actor, a famous, glamorous young man known for playing the tragic roles. And I was a president whose face was coarse and enigmatic, though marked by a conscious mole. But the derringer he stuck behind my ear produced, in the end, a dark, symbolic hole. American and bottomless. No tears can fill it. Your Melville had the accurate verse. What, like a bullet can undeceive? Here the antique eloquence of the national curse. What an ironic martyr I've been. I'm long in a realm that has no ceilings, though dying was worse.
There's a mystery to being wrong, and that has darkened the shadows of my mind. Mainly, I mean, how I could like the song, away down yonder in the land of cotton, for rhyme and what else should I call it but jauntiness, and ignore the euphemistic old times. Think of a song to cover sin, boundless and almost unimaginable sin. My task has been to stare it in the face, faceless though it is. We share a common dark. A mask is what we have. One voice and total silence, and verse intended not to answer, but ask the obvious question hanging in the distance of time. Who is that swinging on the gallows? My friends united by love and innocence? And who is buried in those endless rows, those silent lines of American poetry where metaphors and muses refuse to go?
Madstone Alexander's. I was a superstitious son of a biscuit eater who couldn't divide robbing Paul to pay off Peter, so to speak, as a matter of principle. Yet personal life was different. Concerning the boys, an extravagant wife, I was indulgent with them, protective. Whatever they needed, I provided, believing happiness, so well pleaded, deserved my attention. Their delight gave me delight. And that was how I loved when alive. And now in this night, I grasp the imperfection, but what else should one do? You love your people and do what love requires of them. If suddenly love demands of body and mind, for example, going to the ends of the earth to find a primitive conjure woman who owns the only stone around imbued with healing powers for body and bone. I did it for my boy, who was bitten by a dog, and the stone prevented him from going mad. A fog, a total fog, recalling now such desperation, and to think how desperately I also loved the nation. I was a father of boys, and fathered ideas too. And stubbornly, America, I fathered you.
The gift of prophecy. Being shot on Good Friday was, of course, symbolic and nicely fit the drama. And Pentecost, coming a few weeks later, as I recall, was an unintended, though moving, feature for how my tragic death would be interpreted in time. The actor had no idea what he had done, but he transformed me and made me a saint, in the simple terms of American reflection. I'm not a saint. And true reflection, I've learned in the afterlife, requires a longer perspective, a lesson Americans may have to learn again and again and again. I was the 16th president, born in dark, primitive emptiness, an unimaginable place that yet must be imagined if what I mean symbolically should have a meaning. What prophecy could come from such beginning? I started out from where I started. If I could see ahead, it wasn't far. I wasn't a prophet. I was a man. Always surrounding me was poetry, the tales, adventures in the land, and desire falling short of true desire, and words flung out for sound and music alone, falling down. A shallow art, and young, in keeping with our nature. What future lies ahead? A fine question, one to consider quietly. For now I think I've stumbled onto something that begs a little pause for a cause. Nope, not a saint. I'm an allegory, and that is why I'm still alive.
So be careful what you say. So just again to introduce the cast is Ted Weil, Tara Williams, Lisa Durkis, and Terry Gostin. We have a few minutes, so we'd like to engage in some conversation with Maurice and with the actors and with you all. Does anybody have a comment or a question? Yes, sir, back there.
Yes, does a poem have to be recitable in order for it to be a poem? Suppose someone writes a poem in verse, but it doesn't sound good when you read it aloud. Is it therefore not a poem?
We have another poet in the audience also. Pauletta Hansel is here also. So, yeah.
That's a very loaded question. And like many great questions, it's better just to ask it.
It's in the eye of the beholder.
See, I'm over here an actor thinking, is there anything that can't be performed?
Right.
Tara, you had a question
I did,
that
but I
we thought.
forgot. We came up with this question last night. Life has happened.
Which is why I write it down.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah, thanks. So we were here before and we had the opportunity to do Common Man. And so when we got to talking about you, as we often do at Falcon, because we're kind of big fans,
Yeah, kind of.
what made this so different than the style of Common Man? And we were reading this there. I mean, I don't remember any of the pieces we did in Common Man rhyming at all. And there's so much rhyme in this. And I just wondered what inspired one versus the other.
Oh, boy. I think
Is that another question just to be asked?
part of what I was trying to do with Railsplitter was get a 19th century formal English, American English rhythm and phrasing and things like that. And if you've read anything by Lincoln, any of his well-known speeches or some of his letters, you know, he bothered to make them eloquent. He bothered to give them, you know, just a little bit more. You know, it's more than just information. The Gettysburg Address, some of you can probably recite it. I mean, it's more than just a flat statement. It's much bigger than that, which is why we recite it. And I think Tara's talking about the Falcon Theatre version of The Common Man, which was a book that I published in 2010, something like that, which is much more oral tradition focused, and you know, the kind of thing you would hear sitting on the front porch, maybe in an earlier, slightly earlier era. And the poems in Railsplitter, I wanted them to be kind of halfway between thought and speech.
Okay. Any other questions or comments that you have for Maurice or for the actors?
Yeah, so this is another one for Maurice, although I want to hear from the actors too. But yeah, I'm aware that this isn't the only, and it wasn't the first time that you wrote a book that really was in the voice of a character. And as you know, as someone who writes, I find that fascinating. And I'm just curious about your either choice or your sort of innate inclination to enter into other characters, and maybe also how that affects your writing that is in from a speaker closer to perhaps yourself?
Very loaded question. No, it's a good, it's good, and it's, I often get such a question, and I always appreciate it. I have this thing with poetry where I don't want the poem to just be, you know, the outpouring of my own expression, or a transcription of my own experience necessarily. Because I tend to think that poetry is all around us, and that we are witnesses to it as much as we are creators of it. You know, we're bystanders for some of the best poetry. If you ever find yourself stopping to see a bird that's just landed in a branch, the branch is bouncing under the bird's sudden appearance, and the bird's just riding it. And you know, completely in that part of that motion that the bird clearly accepts, and then it starts singing or whatever. I have a little bit of a modesty issue with wanting the poem to just be me. I don't feel comfortable thinking that way ordinarily. I don't go through the world thinking that way, you know. So, but with the primary voices that I've written in that are clearly not my own, one is Daniel Boone, and one is Lincoln. That's more of my own interpretation of American history, interest in that. About the same time as Daniel Boone is born, Thomas Jefferson is born. Those of us who study American history, Thomas Jefferson is, you know, one kind of American character. Daniel Boone is a totally different kind of American character. Similar with Lincoln. He's much more coming from the Boone line of American character. And I don't know who would have been, you know, so many presidents that we've had have been much more out of the Jefferson line. The guy we got now is probably closer to the Boone. And ironically, the last one was closer to the Jefferson. You can't make this up.
History repeats itself.
It does.
Lisa, do you remember the question about his influences?
Yeah, actually, I did have a question. We talked a lot in here about Lincoln's influence from Shakespeare and his love of Poe and Melville. And I was wondering, who are your influences, or who are people that you have drawn from or are drawn to?
Well, a fellow Kentuckian, Robert Penn Warren. If you're a fan of poetry, I recommend his long poem called Audubon, A Vision, about the bird painter. It's just amazing. He also wrote what do you call it? A poem in verse. And you could stage, and it has been staged back in the 50s, and it's called Brother to Dragons. And it is, as some of you may know this if you're familiar with Kentucky history, Jefferson's wife and her family settled in Western Kentucky. Anybody remember that? Didn't go well. But they had Jefferson's sister, and she wound up dying. And there were two brothers who survived and tried to run their plantation. And it just became a nightmare of racial violence. And ultimately, the brothers were convicted of murdering a slave and were set to be sentenced, for which they could have been hung. And they decided, instead of face that fate, they would shoot each other. Well, one shot the other one, and then the other one missed. And so the brother who survived ran off, and nobody ever heard from him ever again. It totally disappeared. Jefferson never spoke publicly about it. But Robert Penn Warren knew this and wrote Brother to Dragons about it, which is a book-length poem. And it's got Beyond the Grave, Thomas Jefferson. It's got the two brothers. It's got Jefferson's sister, Lucy Lewis. It's got Robert Penn Warren, known as RPW, who's sort of like the interlocutor. You all could do it. It has been done, and I don't know how recently. But
I was like, we're gonna read that.
I'm writing it down.
Good, thank you.
Brothers to Dragon.
Brother to Dragons, and here's a totally, this is going beyond answering your question. The Daniel Boone book that I wrote is called Companion for Owls. I was at a book fair when that book was out, and some knowledgeable guy was sitting beside me and said, "Oh, that's from the book of Job." And I went back home and thumbed through the old book of Job, and there's a passage around chapter 30 where Job says, "I have been a brother to dragons, a companion for owls." So Warren used half of that verse for one of his titles. I used the other for one of mine and didn't know about it. But Warren for sure, a poet from Alabama originally, but lived in Eastern Kentucky. James Still, talking about many of them. Great. Others.
Clint?
Yes.
I have this is Christine. Hello.
Oh, my friend Christine. Hi.
Hi, everybody.
I
I have a question, which is perhaps more mechanical, but in this era of communication by soundbite or 124 characters, are there many, I can't see your audience, are there many young people who come to hear your work?
Raise your hand if you don't have gray hair.
Naturally.
Yeah, there's about two.
There are
There's
two.
two younger folks.
Yeah.
And
Oh, there's
Susan.
Right.
You know, that's actually a good question for the younger folks. So in the world that we live in, I have a college age son and who lives on his computer. What brings you guys out from your screen to experience something live?
Yeah.
Well, we're slightly older than we look. That's part of it. So we're slightly older than we look, and also this is my husband, and he is actually a poet. So
Great.
we turn things like this kind of a lot.
Excellent.
I'd like to ask the actors, because this is a rare experience for me, totally rare, to have something that I've written, reimagined, reconceived, reordered. folks in the audience may not have known this, but they read the poems, they recited the poem, performed the poems out of order from which they appear in the book, which I think is great. And, you know, stimulating for me, from my side of things, but you all performing this kind of theater as opposed to having to wear a costume and stumble across the stage and pick up a prop and, you know, the more conventional theatrical setting. What are the differences for you?
This is a very different discipline. I mean, doing something like this is very, very different. And I would say, as a director, there are actors who can do this kind of thing very well that aren't necessarily great actors in a live play, and vice versa. But then there are other actors who can do both. So it is very different. It's almost like theater and film. It's a very different discipline. And I think, but I always have thought that having the opportunity to do something like this, where you're taking words on the page that weren't written to be necessarily performed and finding a way to bring them to life, makes us better as actors, because it gives us the opportunity to really look into the words specifically. And that's part of our craft as an actor, is to look into the script and to find ways to bring those words to life. But having the opportunity to take words that weren't intended to come out of someone's mouth on stage makes us work harder. It's a great exercise for us, and it's just a lot of fun. Quite honestly, we get to read the kinds of words that we wouldn't otherwise.
And play the people we wouldn't play. I don't think either one of us would be cast as Lincoln.
No, I think I'd probably be more Mary, short and stout.
I think too, we get to be sometimes more precious with the words. When you're doing a play, you gotta move it along. You get, even in a really precious moment, you can't make it too precious, because then it becomes about the actors. And so I think, particularly in this piece, there were a couple things that were just so, when we read through this the first time together, a couple of us had some emotional moments, because I think everyone connects to this president. And so, yeah, you get to kind of just sit in that for a minute and be precious with it and not worry about, I gotta hurry up and get this so somebody else can come and do their thing.
But not often do you get to perform one piece from start to finish. You're popping in and out of scenes. You're, unless you are the lead actor who's in every single scene in the show, you only get to be in little tiny bits and pieces of the story. And in this, you get to tell the entire story in one full poem. And even the ones that we shared, you're still getting to be a part of an entire experience instead of, one little thing here. So in that respect, I really love doing this.
Because whenever I'm doing a stage play, from the get-go, I'm beginning to, even though I've been told not to, I'm beginning to visualize how things are going to take place on the stage. There's so many other things that begin to run through my mind from the beginning. In this case, one, I didn't even have to memorize it because the words were going to be there in front of me. And it allowed me to spend time with each of the pieces I read. And I was amazed at how much my understanding or how I viewed each piece changed throughout the process. Because I read each one of the pieces I read at least 10 times, probably more than that. And I really enjoyed the process of the luxury of being able to spend time with the words and not have to worry about anything else, just thinking about words.
It's not often that we get to spend time with the person that wrote the words. And now that this is our third time to hang out with Maurice, we actually asked him to come over to the theater and have dinner with us. So we kind of feel like it's even more important for us, because we know you now, to make sure that we are doing right by your work.
Well, next thing I do, it will be, for 4 voices. for people wearing black.
Thank you. Any other final comments? Morris will stay for a few moments. He has some of the, do you have Railsplitter with you? He has Railsplitter with him. If you'd like to purchase a book and have him sign it or say hello, he'll be right over here. Again, thank you, Morris, so much. We're so grateful. You were just so wonderful to work with, as are all of our authors and poets that we get to do these kinds of things. And just a real quick commercial, September 14th, we will be at Miami Hamilton campus to read again or perform again Pauletta Hansel's Coal Town Photograph. And two of the actors are here that will be in that. And so we are looking forward to that as well. That'll be our second time to get to that. So we're excited about that as well. Yay. With our friends Raz on Detra. Yay! Thank you again. Thank you for coming. Thank you for